I think we'll start now. And as Pete said, thank you so much for attending this. It's lovely to have people here in person or virtually in person. And with the other webinars in this series, we've had some really interesting discussions and questions and answers at the end. So thank you for attending in the middle of this beautiful day. And we do indeed hope that you're sitting somewhere lovely while listening to this. Though I suspect you'll be in a darkened room in order to be able to see Pete's slides. So if you're familiar with these webinars, or if you came to yesterday's one, you'll be thinking that isn't Catherine Ross of the Church of England, and indeed it isn't. I'm Harriet Carty. I'm the director of Caring for God's Acre, which is a conservation charity focused on burial grounds. Caring for God's Acre has been commissioned to support the work on land and nature of the Church of England Environmental Programme. We just started this contract at the beginning of June. So the first thing that we needed to do was just to host these webinars. I must say it's been an absolute delight. They've all been really interesting, the ones that I've hosted. And yes, so it's been very interesting and great fun. It's also lovely that we're still being lent Catherine's beautiful picture that she was given permission by Nat and Morley to use, which I do think is really well worth having a look at. It's an amazing sort of representation of I think the situation we're facing and often how many of us feel. So far, you've been just saying hello in the chat. That's been lovely. Thank you very much. But from now on, please don't use the chat. But unless you want to still introduce yourselves, people coming in. Oh, yeah, I will try and speak a bit louder. Liam, can you boost my volume at all? Yeah, okay. I'll try and speak a bit slower and a bit louder. If you could put any questions into the Q&A, which is just next to the chat at the bottom of your screens, that works better for us at the end. And also there is a way of voting for questions, which brings the most popular ones to the top and might focus our discussion at the end. Though on the other webinars, we've managed to get through all questions and so had very interesting conversations. We will be sending you out an email after today with the slides and also any links that are mentioned during the talk or during discussions. So please don't feel that you need to be desperately scribbling them down. We will be sending them out, so just sit back and listen and enjoy. And also the recording of this webinar and the previous ones in this week will be shared through the Church of England website. So they're going up very quickly. So if you know of anyone who's unable to attend, please advise them to have a look at that in the next few weeks. This is the last of our webinars in Churches Count on Nature 2023. As many of you know, the other part of Churches Count on Nature has been encouraging people to do some sort of event focused on biological recording within their churchyards. It's been a real bumper year. We had 348 registrations. Of many people were doing more than one event. So we're really delighted with how well that's gone. And also the attendance of these webinars, which have been extremely popular. Just to give you notice of a few things coming up in the future on the Church of England's webinar programme. As you'll see, there's a couple more in June: church solar panels and church heating, and then a bit of a gap until autumn when there's heat pump training. So I'm really delighted to welcome Pete Brotherton to our final webinar. I think we've looked at different types of church-owned land. We've looked at churchyards, we've looked at glebe land, we've looked at the practical, we've looked at the spiritual, and now I think Pete's the perfect person to pull it together and give us a global perspective on the whole crises that we're dealing with. Pete is the Science and Climate Change Director for Natural England, and leads a really considerable team of experts. He's also the diocesan environmental officer for Peterborough, and I think it gives you an idea of the huge expertise within the environmental officers within Diocese. If you haven't yet made contact with or met or know who your diocesan environmental officer is, please do find out. I think you'll probably find that there's a wealth of knowledge and experience within that person that might be of great help to you in managing your churchyard, if you are one of the people who cares for a churchyard. Without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Pete, and off we go.
Thank you so much. I'm going to try and share my screen. I'll just and yeah, just to echo your comments about the Diocesan environmental officers. They're a fantastic group of people. I'm hoping you can see that.
Yep, that's fine. Yep.
Okay, great. So it's fantastic to be with you, and thank you for joining today. I'm very conscious that there's been a brilliant selection of seminars going into quite a lot of detail about about what one can do in churches, on church land. Brilliant panel session on that in particular earlier in the week. So I'm really going to zoom out now. I'm going to say a bit about the latest evidence on climate change and biodiversity loss, the global and UK legal and policy frameworks within which the world and ourselves are trying to respond to those challenges, and then come back to a bit more locally around what we might do and what the opportunities are that that I see might make the biggest difference to tackle nature loss and climate change. I'm not going to focus that much on the church dimension. I will draw that in towards the end, but I think for me, this was more about helping to equip people on the call to be confident about the evidence, to understand the policy frameworks within which that evidence is being used, and some of the challenges that still exist out there. So well, you can let me know at the end if I succeed in that aim. So where are we in terms of the state of nature? Well, globally, we continue to see considerable change. There were some signs of slowing in terms of the way nature was being lost, but that seems to have speeded up again. Sorry, I've flicked forward. I'm just going to come back to that. So 11.1 million hectares of forest were lost in 2021 alone. A hectare of forest is about the same as a football pitch. So we're losing we're losing hectares of forest every few seconds. And that includes primary forest, which is still being lost, often due to clearance for agriculture, but fire we're seeing as an increasing cause. And there's a risk that we're getting feedbacks there that that as climate warms and as we continue to cut down primary forests, they become more vulnerable to further harm. Wetlands around the world have declined by over 35% from 1970 to 2015. And generally, ecologists think that wetlands are about the most vulnerable of all habitats at the moment. We often focus on the forests, but actually the rate at which wetlands have been polluted, drained, or just more affected by human action has been really worrying. Similarly, only 23% of rivers now flow uninterrupted to the sea. All of that change, of course, has had huge impacts on species, and we now estimate about 1 million are at risk of global extinction. This slide is the Living Planet Index for vertebrates. So these are species from fish through frogs, mammals and birds and reptiles. And this is a sort of slide that we get quite used to seeing, isn't it, for nature? So here's a decline showing that we've lost 69% of vertebrates. This isn't vertebrate species, this is vertebrate numbers since 1970. 69% of individuals lost. I worry that we get used to seeing this sort of decline. Let's just zoom out from that for a moment. If that was people, if that was 69% of people being lost globally, that would be the equivalent of losing the entire human population of North America, South America, Europe, Africa, Australia, and China. And this is massive. This is a huge change in my lifetime. And it's why we talk about nature loss as being a crisis. What's happened to all of that? Well, largely all the land that those species occupied, often the species themselves, have been converted into things that we need, or if things ourselves. And here's some statistics from an analysis done a few years ago now, which looked at the distribution of global biomass. That paper is quite interesting. It includes plants. It looks at all just the weight of all living things as best it can estimate. And they concluded back then that people now outweigh all wild animals nearly 10 times over, and our domestic livestock outweigh us by nearly twice. So mammals now account for around 5% of all biomass of mammals. The wild mammals account for about 5% of all mammal biomass. I'm going to say a bit more about that in a moment. Chickens, the biomass of domestic chickens alive at any time, and these are actually not all domestic chickens, these are the broiler chickens, the meat chickens, exceeds all wild birds by over 3 times. And so that's all the seabird colonies, all those big penguin colonies that we're familiar with, as well as all the garden birds that we know. So all birds are outweighed over 3 times by just the meat chickens, the broiler chickens that are alive at any time. I'm going to zoom in on that mammal statistic for a moment. It's a slightly less attractive graphic, but this comes from a paper just out earlier this year, and they've refined their estimates around. Many of the same authors were involved as in that previous paper, and they've refined their estimates. And what they find now is a really startling effect of how much that of the Earth's resources that again that we're capturing for human use. So we outweigh as humans outweigh mammals massively, as you can see. Cattle are still bigger than account for more of the biomass, and I hope biomass isn't too complicated. It's just the weight of biology. It's the weight of ourselves and these creatures. So, and we're looking at megatons here. That's 1 million tons. So all wild mammals on land account for about 20 million tons. All wild mammals at sea, including all the whales and porpoises and so on, account for 40 million tons. And you can see the distribution of the of ourselves and other domesticated animals. Our own pet dogs more or less weigh the same as all wild mammals put together. They come in at about 20 million tons. If you're a cat lover, the global population of cats weighs over twice as much as the global population of elephants. So really startling changes at global level. In the UK, we similarly have a slightly worrying pattern. We often talk about the UK as being one of the most nature depleted nations on the earth. That's largely because of the historic changes that happened. Remember, we started quite early in the way we transformed our natural habitats. We've seen large historic, but they're not just historic, they're often ongoing changes to our habitats, with most of our fenlands lost, Most of our lowland heathlands lost since the 1800, and in the last century, over 97% of flower-rich meadows were lost. So today, over 71% of the UK is under agriculture, and that it gives us that familiar green and pleasant land that we're used to seeing. Of course, England shouldn't be green and pleasant. It should be multicolored. It should be full. It should be a rainbow, and getting the rainbow back is something that I think we need to challenge ourselves to do, if only at local scales. All that habitat loss has of course affected species. Over 40% of species we know to be in decline. That's based on the last State of Nature report that was out a few years ago. The next one's out this year. In fact, I've got a draft of it sitting in my inbox at the moment. I've not quite read it yet, but I unfortunately don't think the picture will be looking much better. 25% of mammals are now threatened with extinction. There are 73 million fewer birds over the past 50 years, and flying insects, based on a very small sample, it has to be said. So cautious about this result, please. But flying insects may have declined by 64% in the last 20 years. And earthworms, again, early stages on this research, but pretty robust, actually, I think. Earthworms have probably declined by over a third in the past 25 years. And all of these statistics are sad. I'm sure many of us would find, well, that's sad, but they're also hugely consequential. Those last two statistics, losing our insects that include our pollinators, losing our earthworms, are a sign that our soils and the food systems that we rely upon are dying. And it's a real call to action. These things aren't just sad, these matter to us. We know nature delivers a lot. I've just mentioned pollination. We can increasingly put values on that. So there are two ways of looking at the value of pollination. One is how much would the food, how much food do we produce in the UK that relies upon wild pollinators, and that's about 680 million pounds, probably a bit more than that now. That value is a few years old, but about 680 million pounds in terms of the food production. But if we wanted that food, replacing that pollination function is much more expensive, probably over 3 billion pounds it would take to mechanically pollinate those crops, if that's what we wanted to do, because we needed that food. So sometimes I think we often underestimate the value of what nature is doing for us for free. And it may sound ridiculous, manual pollination, but you may have seen pictures in parts of China, for example, where they have lost so many of their pollinators that they are climbing fruiting trees with paintbrushes and manually pollinating the flowers to get the fruit that they need locally. But beyond, but a lot of people object to putting values on nature. They view it as a category error, almost akin to saying, well, how much do you want for your mother? They would say, well, look, I know my mother's incredibly valuable. She's hugely important to me. I rely on her so much, but I can't give you a value for that. And yet that's often what we're doing as we look at what nature brings us. I'm fairly relaxed about doing that, provided we don't think that we're capturing all the values. I think it is useful to capture monetary values where we can, because it helps economists and the politicians that often rely a lot on economists to make better decisions. Because if we don't value nature at all, then nature's often assumed to be worth nothing in those economic models. So I think getting good values where we can get them, or economic values where we can use them, are important. But I don't think that for a moment captures the whole value of nature, and we need to be careful about those approaches. But it can open doors to conversations, and it can even open doors, you don't have to be a politician. Farmers understand the importance of healthy soils. They understand the importance of pollinators, for example. A lot of other things are on this slide. I'm not going to go into those in much detail, but nature's a really important source of coastal protection, whether that be just from normal weather systems, but certainly in hurricane systems, they can be hugely important in some parts of the world, mangrove forests and so on. For tourism and recreation, just well-being, isn't it? Our daily lives, our health, contact with nature, we know to be good for us, and we can quantify those benefits increasingly. And I think one of the things that we all learned from COVID was how important that contact was for people's well-being, and a host of other things there. So last on the list was climate regulation. I'm now going to just turn briefly to look at the latest evidence around climate. So this is a graph that I'm sure many of you have seen before, or something like it. It's a graph taken from Antarctican ice cores, which look back at the temperature and equivalent CO2 levels going back for 800,000 years. Now, the last 300,000 of those is when modern humans have existed on Earth. And I think one of the things I take from this is there's two things I think to notice from this graph. One is that the CO2 levels in the atmosphere that we're breathing today have never been breathed by people before. We're unique. Hooray. Always nice to feel unique, though this is a bit of a bitter thing to experience. So people have never lived in the situations that we've been in before. And the other thing to look at is the bit just before that graph shoots up. And actually, that period is around 15,000 years, that period of fairly static. Look at that blue line. Now, we can see it bounces all over the place. And going back a million years, yes, it bounces all over the place. But that 15,000 years is when modern societies evolved. So when people say, well, there's always been climate change, yes, there has always been climate change, but we haven't lived as people in the way that we now expect societies to function in times of massive climate change. We just haven't experienced this. And sudden rapid climate change is not something that human societies are necessarily well equipped to cope with. Sometimes when I first used to look at these slides, I was thinking, well, how do they know? How do they know those things from ice cores? Well, sorry, indulge me here. I find this sort of thing interesting, and forgive me if you don't. But the way that they can get this information from ice cores is because they go in, look very carefully at the ice cores, extract the ice in very thin layers from the bubbles of air that have been trapped in those ice cores. They can measure the amount of carbon dioxide. They can actually just get the exact amounts of carbon dioxide. But there are two forms of oxygen, isotopes of oxygen, that exist in the atmosphere, and the ratio that those fall in rain is determined by the temperature. So if you also measure the ratio of those two types of oxygen in the water, H2O, remember, is what water is, around that same bit of air that you've captured in the bubbles of ice, in the air bubbles within the ice, then you get that pattern. So you get to say, okay, well, what was the carbon dioxide temperature, what was the carbon dioxide level, and what was that temperature at that time? So that's how they produce these graphs. Anyway, sorry if that wasn't too interesting. Just coming a bit closer, we can see that carbon dioxide levels and greenhouse gases continue to rise. This slide is just to remind us that increasingly we're able to say, well, what are the causes of CO2? And we can, see actually fossil fuel rise still going up, but so too is the amount coming from land use change and so on. And of course, this graph also helpfully reminds us that this isn't just about the carbon dioxide. There are other gases out there that cause a great deal of problems for the climate too. We know that global average temperatures have risen massively. We're probably about 1.2 to 1.3 degrees above pre-industrial levels. The last 8 years, we've seen a real leap up. So that little cluster of dots that are above 1.2 have all been in the last 8 years. They're the hottest on record. Our Paris climate change agreement back in at COP21, the climate change COP21 in Paris in 2015, aimed to limit warming to 1.5 degrees compared to pre-industrial levels, and we're almost there. And increasingly, scientists are saying we're going to hit 1.5 this decade. And just a reminder, 1.5 isn't a target. Many scientists are at pains to say this is a limit beyond which we begin to lose control of our climate systems. 1.5 or whatever temperature we're seeing is an average global figure. Most of the Earth is ocean. So, and that warms more slowly than land, and there are huge differences in the way that 1.2 degrees or 1.3 degrees that we are now is being seen. So some parts of the Earth are already warming by more than 5 degrees. The polar regions in particular are warming fast, and that leads to increasing concerns of ice melting and sea level rise, but also, of course, feedback loops, because that ice is no longer reflecting sun back into the atmosphere. And so if we zoom in a little bit, going back, yes, that 1.5 degrees isn't, or 1.3 degrees isn't experienced evenly. Europe is already above, in terms of landmass, we're already way beyond 1.5 degrees. We've seen some really shocking records broken last year across much of Europe, where large parts of Western Europe experienced their warmest temperatures ever on record, including in the UK, where several parts of the country were over 40 degrees. 40 degrees is often treated as a significant number in some of the climate literature, because it's around that temperature that it becomes really hard for people to live outside. And so long periods of 40 degrees become really difficult in terms of people continuing to live in those parts of the planet. There are, as the climate warms, there's growing concern about tipping points or carbon cycle feedbacks. The terrestrial ecosystems that we have currently store over 4 times the amount of carbon than is currently in our atmosphere. So releasing all of that would clearly be a complete disaster. So there's real interest in how we keep carbon locked up where it is, such as in vegetation or permafrost and soils, and concerns that some of that gets released as the climate warms. We're seeing increases in wildfires, tree mortality as a result of extreme weather events, insect pest outbreaks and so on, and concerns that these will amplify feedbacks on the climate system, and of course the melting ice caps that I've already mentioned. So that was, clearly we need to mitigate climate change. We need to reduce the amount of carbon dioxide that's in the atmosphere to try and reduce the amount of global warming that does happen. But mitigation is no longer enough. Climate change is already happening, and extreme events are impacting the UK. So we've seen that heat wave that I mentioned a moment ago, and it was virtually impossible, the Met Office tells us, that could have happened without human-induced climate change. And I think it's really useful for those of us who still occasionally encounter the kind of climate change denier out there to just say, no, this isn't tenable anymore. There aren't situations where that could have just been a natural event, that wasn't caused by a flare, a solar flare or something like that. That kind of intense period of heat over protracted periods in Europe just isn't normal. We saw temperatures exceeding 40 degrees in multiple locations, and the predictions from the Met Office are that by 2050, hot summers could happen every other year, hot summers being ones that exceed 40 degrees. We're seeing increasing examples of heavy rainfall, February 2020 was the wettest on record. Last year's Storm Ciara saw months of rainfall falling parts of West Yorkshire in just 18 hours with widespread flooding. And again, we're expecting by 2070 those rainfall events to become really quite normal. And some of this can be, you can get these really strange events. So you may have picked up that earlier this year, Somalia, just I think about 6 weeks ago, Somalia, that was gripped by a terrible drought, suddenly at the same time as trying to tackle that drought, was struggling with massive floods, because when the rains did come, they came in complete torrential downpours that were impossible to deal with. And of course, much of that water won't have benefited the crops and the people that needed it. And wildfires, we're seeing, I hesitate a bit about wildfires as a term in the UK. Actually, globally, we doubtless see wildfires happening all the time. And what's happening in Canada is a real current example of the problems that will bring. In fact, in the UK, we struggle to find examples of where fires are genuinely started by nature. It's usually a human involved somewhere, even if it's a discarded bottle or a barbecue that's gone out of control. But certainly out of control fires are increasing in the UK. And the view is that those out of control fires are likely to be 5 times more likely by the end of the century. Because climate is locked in, adaptation is now essential to address those changes. So we need to manage risks that are already here, those ongoing impacts, the impacts that we're already committed to. We can't turn climate change off quickly. We can't affect the climate system that much. And the thinking is generally that it's 2 or 3 decades of locked in climate change, whatever we do now. So those are impacts that we're now committed to, that will occur even if emissions were rapidly reduced today. And then, of course, we need to plan for the possible outcomes in the future, including long-term worst case scenarios. And this is something that we're not good at doing, and we're not good at thinking that through as a country. So typically what I think we see a lot of at global and national levels is people looking at the graphs and taking that midpoint and saying, okay, well, that's probably what will happen. And we're developing policies and taking action as if that probably line is what we're likely to see. But actually, that is not a good way of making decisions. My house is insured not because of what I think will probably happen tomorrow. I take out insurance in case of something bad happening, and because I know that bad thing may happen. And I think so I think we don't do enough about looking at some of the extreme scenarios that are entirely plausible. They may be less likely, but they're plausible scenarios, which see sea level rise going a lot faster than is expected, which see temperature warming much quicker than we're expecting, and so on. And I think more needs to be done to plan for those more extreme scenarios. But whatever we're doing, we need to think about that those extreme, those at least the projected outcomes. So the impacts for the next 20 years are locked in, and so adaptation is what's needed to respond to that. That's what we will feel. That's the experience. So nobody will notice if we're taking carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere immediately. What they will notice is the actions that we take to reduce the urban heat effects in our towns and cities, to reduce the likelihood of the impacts of the flooding that is now more and more likely, and so on. So this is adaptation that we really need to do. And estimates from the Climate Change Committee are that early adaptation actions represent very good value for money. So £1 invested in adaptation could result in £2 to £10 of net economic gain. Bringing these two crises together then, nature and climate, I'm talking about them separately at the moment, but they're not separate, they're intricately linked. Ecosystems are a large part of the global greenhouse gas balance. Degradation of ecosystems is a major cause of climate change, with about over a third of historic CO2 emissions resulting from that. In England, more carbon is emitted every day from degraded peat, particularly in lowland peat, than is locked up by our trees each day. Despite the losses that have happened, over half of our emissions are still absorbed by the land and the sea. But ecosystems and biodiversity are vulnerable to climate change. So we see these feedback loops, and that's probably not about just the average temperature. It's much more these extreme effects that drive changes, these extreme weather events, sorry, that drive changes in nature. Protection and restoration of ecosystems is a key part of climate change, therefore, both to adapt and mitigate the impacts of climate change. Nature-based solutions is a term that is about using nature for societal problems. They could be about health, they could be about a whole range of things. But when we apply them to climate change, the estimates globally are that they could lock up about 20% of global emissions if we deployed them well. So that's all a bit glum, isn't it, to put it mildly? There's, you know, I've more or less said, look, the planet's dying and you know, and it's burning up, haven't I? We're, you know, we need to act in hope here, and it's not too late. The world is acting, and I'm just going to say a little bit now about that response. So we've seen good global commitments for climate change. The Paris Agreement is obviously the one that we all know about most, with a commitment to limit global warming to no more than 2 degrees above pre-industrial levels, and aiming for less than 1.5, and increasingly people just talk about the 1.5, don't they, which is reassuring, although we're galloping towards it. There are increasing mitigation measures and funding for renewables in particular around the world. We saw new commitments at COP26 to limit deforestation. And finally, and this is something that climate change politicians have been trying to get together for so long, agreement on a loss and damage fund in COP27. None of this is enough. The money in that loss and damage fund is nothing like what people have hoped for, but the fact that we've agreed in principle that Western nations should have global North nations, technically, I suppose I should say, have a moral responsibility to the global South to pay for loss and damage, I think is a real positive step forward. And once these funds are created, they tend to grow rather than shrink. On nature, biodiversity, we finally got our COP15 that was due to happen in 2020, happened late last year with the conclusion of, this was due to be hosted in China. It ended up being hosted by Canada, but still with a Chinese presidency. So we call it the Kunming Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework. And that pretty much gave us that Paris moment for biodiversity that people had hoped for, with 23 global targets agreed to halt and reverse biodiversity loss by 2030, and that headline commitment to protect 30% of land and sea for nature. Sticking with nature for a moment, England's been really quick to respond to those commitments. And I have to say, the UK government should be really proud of itself for the global leadership it showed in getting to that agreement. It jointly leads the so-called High Ambition Coalition for Nature and the Oceans Coalition, the Oceans Alliance, which was championing the 30 by 30 target, and has made a range of commitments. We're amongst the first nation to have legally binding targets in our Environment Act, and those were confirmed late last year. And our apex target is to halt the decline in species abundance by 2030, supported by a range of other targets, such as around improving water quality, increasing water cover, woodland cover, reducing waste for air quality, and marine protected areas. So some positive things there in terms of legislation. and we see those now in the environmental improvement plan published at the start of this year. And we see additional commitments beyond those legally binding targets that relate to the COP15 targets, including to protect 30% of land and sea for nature, which are really good. There are some gaps if you do a detailed read across from the 23 global targets to domestic commitments. There are some gaps, such as for pesticides and around restoring degraded nature, but the government's made a commitment to fill those gaps. On climate, there are, again, the UK was the first country in the world to have legally binding climate change targets. And these are periodic reviewed. So the headline figure from back in 2008 is to get to net zero by 2050 compared to the 1990 level. In 2021, the 78% target by 2035 was added as a legally binding target. And there are also commitments in that Climate Change Act to adapt to climate change. So we've got laws. So what, really? Well, I think there's a, and how are we doing towards that? Well, just worth saying, so I'll come back to why I've got these two pictures on, but let's just go into some of the details. So the UK has met or exceeded all its carbon budgets so far. So within the Climate Change Act requires us to have 6-year carbon budgets. So when we've just completed the third of those, and we're on track is the answer. So we've reduced our carbon emissions by 48% since 1990, the fastest reduction in the Group 7 nations. But it's really important to realize that the low-hanging fruit have now largely been used up. So the biggest component of that was taken by moving away from coal, switching to gas as a cleaner form of powering our energy systems. That's what accounted for a big chunk of that 48%, and some other changes to our transport infrastructure and so on. Those low-hanging fruit are now used up, and the targets to get to 2037 over the next 3 cycles are going to be much, much harder, I think. The reason I've got these two graphs up is the net zero strategy is really our fundamental response to how we get to net zero over the current period. That was published in 2021. And because there was a Climate Change Act, some bodies were able to take the government to court to say that's not good enough. That net zero strategy doesn't have enough detail in it to know that you're getting to net zero. So the government has just this year published a revised net zero growth plan to provide that detail of how we can get to net zero. There are gaps in it, there are uncertainties and so on. But I think what I was heartened from that is it showed that the Act is working. Environmental acts can work, at least in terms of holding government to account. And increasingly, we're seeing examples of specific cases where the Climate Change Act is being used to get changes in government decisions. And I think that's a good thing and gives me encouragement when it comes to the Environment Act targets for nature. Just very briefly, please don't worry about the detail here, but these are assessments by the UK Climate Change Committee on how we're doing on the adaptation obligations on the Climate Change Act. The red areas across 61 risks identified are those where much more action is needed. The blue are also where we don't really know, and only the green ones are where the action looks good enough. So a long way to go in properly adapting to climate change. And many would argue that our response to adaptation is lagging further behind what we've said for what we're doing for mitigation. Much more needed there, given the locked-in future ahead of us. I've nearly finished talking, you'll be pleased to hear. Returning to nature, much of the change for nature needs to happen locally. And for me, it boils down to 3 big changes that are needed. Firstly, the places that are meant to be good for wildlife need to be working for wildlife. Our special places for wildlife need to be in better condition. So these could be our sites of special scientific interest, our local wildlife sites, patches of nature that are left. Far too few of those are left, but they need to work for nature. And part of the problem that we see at the moment is that though nature is declining in those core sites. And that creates problems because when we do things elsewhere, there aren't the dispersing individuals to move into those new patches of nature. So special places need to work well for nature. Churchyards and so on are often the most special places particularly in our urban environments. But what we have left is nothing like enough. We need more bigger, messier places for nature. By messier, I mean habitat mosaics. And what we do know is that a lot of species respond to early stages of habitat. So early successional habitats like scrub or ponds that can be created quite quickly. And that gives me hope as somebody who's working with the government and saying, yes, you can get to that 2030 target, when they're looking at the graph saying, well, it's still going down. How are these species going to turn around and say, well, big, messier places for nature with scrub and ponds in them, over 50% of species can respond to that quickly. So more bigger, messier places for nature, particularly in lowland areas. That's where we have far too little diversity in England. And then reducing the pollution, the poison really, that we put on our land through nutrients and pesticides. Those are the three big changes that are needed to help recover nature. But to achieve that, we need a much different approach to the way we use land and sea. We need an integrated approach to land use. The government has promised a land use strategy, but we need plans that set out to achieve those changes, the three that I've just mentioned, but also create the space for everything else that society needs: change for climate mitigation, solar farms, so on, space for growing food, space for people to enjoy being out in the countryside and so on. So at the moment, I think we use our land very inefficiently, and land is becoming increasingly precious. That needs to change, and society needs to make choices there and be part of a decision in the country, which is where we hold our land very closely, and that's challenging. We own land and we're jealous of that land as a country. And I think that is creating challenges for us. And of course, many places, as we make changes, need to deliver more than one thing. So wild places will deliver for species, but they can also deliver climate mitigation, water management and recreation and so on. Tools and money are increasingly available. I've talked about the net zero strategy. There's a local climate action chapter if you're interested. There's a £750 million Nature for Climate Fund, Woodlands and Peat. That was underspent last year. We're not spending this money that's being made available for us. There's an enhanced biodiversity duty on local authorities and a stronger national planning policy framework that says people should be planning for ecological networks. Local nature recovery strategies are the new kid on the block. Money is coming with those to help deliver integrated plans that communities can be part of, but will deliver local nature recovery networks that can help to join up sites and make more space for nature. Developers are having to now deliver mandatory net gain from developments, often by buying biodiversity credits, leading to opportunities for small losses that would have happened anyway before this was brought in on-site to be consolidated into potentially some quite big gains for nature. We're seeing carbon markets developing with new private sector investment in trees in particular, and also peat restoration. Our new environmental land management scheme, which is the agri-environment scheme, is being reshaped to deliver more benefits for people. Still nearly £3 billion going towards landowners, mostly farmers, but more of that money is being spent to benefit, to get outcomes for climate and nature. And we're seeing nature positive commitments being made by the private sector in a new framework of financial disclosures coming in, at least at European level, which will require companies to say more about their impacts on nature. And I think all of this all of this sits under the legally binding targets, which are going to be key to driving action, and I'm hopeful that they will work. Final thoughts on the final slide. No change isn't an option. It's too late for us to stop climate change, though we can still prevent its worst impacts and possibly be in control of our futures if we act fast. We haven't run out of time. IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, agrees that we haven't run out of time yet, but we will do soon. So let's act fast. We need to tackle the climate and nature crisis together. Nature-based solutions can help us to survive that uncertain future, such as by planting more trees, restoring peat and creating wilder spaces and reinstated floodplains. But we need to change as society and as individuals. We need to change what we think is beautiful as we look out into the countryside, how we use the land. We need to want change in treasured landscapes. We need to think about what we eat, eating less meat and being careful about the sources of food that we use. Think about how we spend our money. That's really where our power is. And somehow we need to succeed in bringing people with us. Everybody wants this to happen, but they don't want it to happen on their doorstep. How do we make that change? How can we and what's the role of the church in bringing about that change of hearts and minds? We need to accept that some modern agriculture is unsustainable and can't continue. We need it to use less space and less fertilizers and pesticides. This sounds like we want it all, but there have been quite careful analyses that suggest we could have 5 million hectares of less land being used for agriculture in England without a noticeable impact on calorific production from that land. Politicians need to know that people want them to do this. I don't think they do at the moment. I don't know what you're seeing, but climate is still being spoken about a bit in the political discourse at the moment, but nature has dropped. People have gone silent as we rush towards an election on nature. And I think that the space there is really complicated. So we need to tell politicians that this still really matters to us. We need to act in hope. Change can happen. I've said enough about legally binding targets. And I just, those of us who are involved with the church on this call, give ourselves a bit of a pat on the back. I think the church is increasingly showing good leadership in making progress towards that positive change for nature and climate. And I'll encourage you to look back on the other webinars this week to see more examples of that. Thank you. I'll end there.
Thank you very much, Pete. Would you like to stop sharing your slides now, please? We have a few questions. We are quite low on time, but sorry. I think oh no, please don't apologize. It was absolutely fascinating, marvelous talk. I mean, quite bleak in some places, but really a message I'm sure we all felt we needed to hear, and we're delighted to hear. I'd like to just keep this running and deal with all of the questions, but obviously some people may need to leave. We've just seen somebody already saying thank you very much and having to leave. But if you're happy, Pete, we'll just keep going for a few minutes and questions. We start with a rather lovely question. You've got some quite tough ones, but we'll start with Karen's questions about what should we be including and seeing in the rainbow at a local level. I thought it was a beautiful image, the idea that it shouldn't be a green and pleasant land, it should be a rainbow land.
So what sparked this thought for me is somebody recently that I was speaking, well, a couple of years back actually now, it feels like recent, possibly even pre-COVID, but everything's like that, is came back from Slovenia saying they just had the most incredible time walking in the Slovenian hills, and they're surrounded by a cloud of butterflies and, sitting in a rainbow of flowers. And, why should somebody have to go to Slovenia to see that? And I think the point being, really, Karen, is that when we look out on a bright green landscape, that's usually a fertilized space of early stage crop or rather intensively grazed agriculture. And actually, that isn't what we need to see. We need those places to be full of flowers. We need people to be able to, you know, your kids or yourselves, doesn't have to be kids. I'd love it as much as anyone. I'm sure we all would, to, you know, embrace that diversity. I was struck visiting the Olympic Park all those years ago, how there was fantastic planting of just messiness. It was just abundant nature, and people were just sitting next to it and sitting amongst it, and just loving it. And you know, so we need more of that. We need more places to experience abundant nature, and yeah, the insects will come if the flowers are there. So yeah, that's what I mean by a rainbow. So looking out on a patchwork of, so even a heathland, and I mean diversity. So a heathland, we often think of as you know, as it's all purple, isn't it? If it's just purple, that's not great. Only 10% of heathland species need Calluna, that heather, that species, that purple species. Most of the species that live there or would like to live in heathland need scrapes. They need messy bits of scrub, bits of Calluna, but bits of a bare earth, bits of wet patches, and so on. We need to embrace messiness, and we could do that at lots of scales, in our own garden, through to churchyards, through to the countryside. Messy is good.
Lovely. What a lovely image. Yes, so thank you for that. I'm going to hold that in my head. We've had three, I think it's three or four questions from anonymous attendee. I think some of them this person was asking questions as you went along, and I think some of it you answered later on in your talk. The first was with your initial statistics, which were extremely depressing. Kind of hard to get my head around. Are we doomed already? I don't know if you have anything more to say on that. I think you did explain myself where you were, but perhaps you could.
Yeah, I think the simple answer is we don't know, but if we don't act quickly, we definitely will be. So I hope we're not. You know, if you're being absolutely candid, there are some people who say, oh gosh, we've probably already passed some tipping points, and that is and there have been reports out recently where they're saying, look, we've got a 50% chance of passing some of these tipping points in the next 10 years. So that's really problematic if we do. We don't know, and we won't know, actually. We'll only look back on it. So this is all just, I think, reason for greater action, not for despair. And I think in a way, there is no absolute here. There is no point at which it's now so bad that nothing, you know, at least in a UK context. Sorry, I roll back from that a little bit. If you're an island nation with in some parts of the world, there are some absolutes. There will be times where that nation just isn't there anymore, where that island isn't there anymore. Hopefully the nation will still exist and the people will still exist, but the island will be lost. And we've seen some examples of islands already being lost. But I think there aren't many absolutes here. It's all relative. So how bad is it going to get? That's in our gift. So I think we need to feel really empowered to you know, to take action, because actually that also means that what I do today matters. Because it's all relative, and if I make it worse, even by a little amount, that still is adding to the picture. If I make it better by a little amount, that's adding to the picture too. So I think what this, for me, what the statistics say is we're in a crisis. So what that means is we need to act as if we're in a crisis, not just keep watching the numbers get worse. So feel empowered by those, and empowered to do something different, empowered to be demanding of politicians and so on. That's where I would go with those statistics.
Thank you. The next question from the same person was, wasn't there a report the other week that said we'd already passed 1.5 degrees?
I think that report was saying there's a 50% chance of passing it in the next 7 years, before 2030. That was what that report was. I think I know the report that this person's alluding to. So we haven't yet passed one. I mean, you can choose a baseline. I mean, there is a that, you know, there's something about baseline here that we need to worry about. And as I've said, you know, this is all global averaging. Europe has passed 1.5 degrees. We're already at about 2.3. There's a recent graph produced on the North Atlantic temperature this year, and it's worrying. It's off the scale. We're rushing ahead this year. This year, some people think there's a chance that we might just go up, but the graphs, as you've noticed, don't just go in one way. They'll go up one year and go down. So last year wasn't the warmest year globally, even though the trend is still going up. So if we go above it, it doesn't mean we won't go back down below it. And I think it's that smoothed average over multiple years that really matter. But yeah.
There's also something there, isn't there, about how science is rarely a simple yes or no. It's more often nuanced. It's within a range. It needs a little bit of explanation. And I think we all, and particularly I think the media, wants a straightforward answer. They want a simple reply, and often measuring science really doesn't lend itself to that in a way that's meaningful and robust.
Yes, but there's also a worry there, isn't there? Because when we're at 1.5 and the world hasn't ended for us, what does that? How do people understand that? They'll have been told for a decade, we cannot, don't go beyond 1.5. Then we get to 1.5, and their days don't change. They still go to work that next day, and so on. And so there is something about how we, and I'm including everybody on this call really, because I suspect you're all leaders and influential in some way, and many of you will be part of conversations that can shift things. It's how we build the collective understanding of what that means, because it won't be the day won't feel different when we're at 1.5 than it did the day before. But you know, I do think it's something that we need to be ready for people then not losing faith that this is a really important thing to still tackle as we move beyond each of these thresholds, because we will continue to need to act. And I don't think there's anybody who thinks, really, nobody that I speak to thinks it's likely that we'll manage to stick to 1.5, because we're emitting more carbon than we ever have, we're exploring more oil fields than we ever have, and so on. So the trend is not in a good direction.
No. I think the next point from that same person is more a statement than a question. It's how can we take any notice of these government targets when governments committed to limit global warming to 1.5, they didn't bother to do it. Moving on to Kate's question, which is water quality. There's another one. If you could solve that for us all, Pete, we'd be very grateful. Water quality improvement under current situation, huge shareholder payouts, etc. To me, seems almost impossible. How can water quality improvement be achieved? I mean, I wonder if it's again that point you were making, that when we do have legally binding strategies and targets, we can take our own government to court.
Yeah, and so what's being brought in at the moment, and my day job organisation, Natural England's been part of this, has been that nutrient neutrality plans are being brought in, where we're agreeing limits for particular areas in terms of how much nutrient can be in water systems and within catchments, and anything that's going above that limit needs to do something to mitigate it. So that could be a water company wanting to do something in terms of putting effluent into or treated effluent into water systems, and therefore needing to engage with farmers to do something different. So there are mechanisms that can do that. The most, and I think that example points to a much more important mechanism. It would be regulatory, and some governments don't like regulation in this area, but it would be agreeing safe nutrient limits for catchments and setting those targets and making that really then enforcing those targets. The focus at the moment is on water companies, rightly so, because who wants sewage in river systems and so on. It's just worth saying that most nutrients come from farmland. So while the focus is on water companies, the more difficult solutions are in tackling the amount of nutrients leaching in from farmlands and the amount of soil. And it's not just nutrients, because this is soil that's often washed away. Flood water is always brown. That's because of the soil in it. So that's about our future food security when the soil is washed away. So something about locking the soils up, soil health, and managing the nutrients going onto land is another big part of it. And that can all be part of a nutrient plan. And there are proposals to have those. We're not going to get them, I think, not this side of an election at least.
Okay, thank you.
But there are ways forward there, I think, that we can see.
Anita asked an interesting question. I've heard many people ask this question. Is that how are we helping farmers diversify if we're all going to move to eating less meat?
So I think it's a really good question. So what do I think of it? So firstly, I don't think many so it depends a lot. I don't know, Anita, your background or indeed those of people on the farm. I'm not anti-farming. I eat food every day. I need farming, and farming can be compatible with rich and diverse nature and climate solutions and so on. So I just put down a marker there. I'm not anti-farming. What we see is intensive farming at a scale that I don't think is anything about diversification. Actually, I think the big chicken farms, big pig farms, and so on, often done commercially by tenanted operators that occupy large numbers of different farms in different parts of the country, and so on. They're not the small country file type farmer that we would often see. Increasingly, what more hands-on farmers are doing is switching to more regenerative agricultural techniques, where they have got diverse crop regimes, where they are using fewer numbers of animals that end up being higher quality and attracting premium prices and so on. So I think there are ways that one can do this. And the other thing about diversifying farmer incomes is paying farmers for what they're delivering for society more. And that's what these new schemes are doing. So water quality benefits that farmers are providing because of what they're doing or not doing to their land is something they can be paid for through these schemes. Ditto climate benefits, nature benefits, and so on. So there are this is about diversifying sources of income, some from public money because they're delivering public benefits, carbon credits, and so on. There's a whole range of a greater range of opportunities. In fact, I think it's almost become overwhelming for farmers who don't know how to act and when to act. They're just being told there's lots more money out there, and how to access it is quite hard. And quite a lot of work now is going on to make that much more possible for farmers to engage with.
Yes, thank you. Yes. I think we'd all agree with Maggie, who says, a brilliant talk. What a privilege to hear you, Peter. Indeed, it has been. Our anonymous attendee is less happy, I'm afraid, and less full of hope, saying what we do doesn't matter. But I'm just going to move on to another question, which is from Stuart, which is, why aren't all of the funds in the Nature for Climate Fund being spent? Is it accountability for all targets, plans, and spending the funds strong enough? Yes, I'm not quite sure what you're meaning with the second half of that question, but perhaps.
Sorry, yeah. Strangely, yeah. I'm struggling to see the questions on the chat, so I'll just.
I'll read it again.
No, that's fine.
Q&A, not the chat.
I think I heard the first bit.
Yes.
The hardest part of that Nature for Climate Fund spend has been trying to find people willing to plant trees. So we're trying very hard to make sure that the right tree is planted in the right place. So there will be some commercial forestry planted, and we need more wood. We use wood, we import wood, that's fine. But actually, most of those are non-native species, so aren't so good for our own native woodland species. And actually, what we know from a carbon perspective is that broadleaf woodland, native woodland, after the first 30 years outcompetes in terms of carbon sequestration a pine commercial forest. So you might get a rapid hit for carbon benefit, but actually that pine is then used, a lot of it's burnt, or a lot of it's used for wood chip or short lifespan wood. And actually having a mature forest that's just allowed to grow and be a forest is really what we need in lots of parts of the land. And I think landowners are looking at the fund thinking, okay, well, that's what you'll pay me today. Climate change is getting worse. Will you pay me more tomorrow? Wait, I can only get paid once for this, once I plant my trees. I'm putting words, the simple fact is we're finding people aren't coming forward to say they want to plant this land. And it feels a big step for people who have, I get it really, people who feel that they're farming, that's what they do. They're not foresters, they're not woodland managers. I think there's a big social barrier to cross there, and behavioural change, and you know, how does that work for me? And of course, it's not all or nothing. What we're often offering and hoping for is people to plant part of their land. So again, coming back to that diverse income opportunity. So take the least agriculturally productive part of land and plant that up. For example, and that's the kind of conversations that we're trying to get into. But it's just people have not been rushing forward to say, yeah, I'll have that money and I'm going to plant trees.
The second half of that question was, is accountability for all targets, plans and spending of funds strong enough? So, I mean, sometimes it can be the accountability that actually hinders the spending of the fund, isn't it? Where people are loath to go into something where they feel that they'll be asked to keep a lot of paperwork and then pulled up on some technicality in years to come. So
I think there's a real country dilemma here, and you know, I'm not. It'd be interesting to hear what others think. Really, that our approach at the moment, the government's approach at the moment, and I mean our approach, is almost a country approach, is that people own land, and it's almost a cultural thing for, perhaps I think strongest in England than any other part of the UK, but in England, somebody owns the land and it's their land, and they should largely be allowed to choose what they do with their land. So everything is very much persuasive, incentive-led, and so on. In other countries, that's not what's happening. They're saying, actually, we need land to plant more trees. We will buy this land and compulsory purchase it, just like you would for HS2 or a nationally important infrastructure project. As we do that sometimes in the UK, don't we? But we don't do that for nature at all. We're not at the moment saying, or for climate, we're not at the moment saying we simply need this land to be different. And I wonder if at some point we will get to that stage where, instead of relying on incentives and persuasion, country turns around and says, actually, this isn't changing quickly enough. We need to do something different, and we need a regulatory route to say, actually, this is simply what we're going to have to do in this place. This is the right place to do it, and just take that decision away from people. So yeah. I think that's the opportunity, Stuart, in the future, or not whether it's an opportunity or not, it's a threat. And I think landowners are very worried about that. So how we change the narrative around this, so that, because what isn't going to be helpful if people turn against nature or against climate mitigation because they're feeling done to. But that is what's happening in some countries. Going back to the earlier question about nutrients, in the Netherlands, they're spending 15 billion euros to tackle their nutrient problems, which is including buying out sectors of agriculture. Big chunks of the country just being said, actually, we can't farm here anymore. So I think there's you know, other countries are much more interventionist than we have been so far.
One could imagine, particularly specific flood risk areas, that might be the case, mightn't it? That key pieces of land that under current management allow homes downstream to flood. One could imagine those decisions being made quicker than some other ones. That's the end of our questions, and I can see that whilst an awful lot of you have been able to stay with us to the end, thank you very much. Some people have needed to leave. We've got a few comments in the chat thanking you very much for your talk and planning to share it with other members of their church and things like that. So I think we will come to a close now. There'll be no more questions coming for a while, so I'm guessing everybody's said what they want to say and asked what they want to ask. But thank you so much.
Thank you for find a bit of nature. Great.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely.
Thank you all for joining. I'm sorry I went over time.
No, please don't apologize. It was really a really excellent webinar. I think we've all found it extremely interesting and learned a lot from it. Thank you very much indeed, Pete.
Thank you.
Okay.
Bye.
We'll close then.
Bye. Take care.